Hello, good morning, everybody. I hear that there are already over 500 of us in this webinar, so I think that's a very good opportunity for us to kick off and to use the full hour that we have together. So thank you so much for joining and welcome to CAF's UK Giving Report 2026 webinar. I am Laura Yonish. I'm Client Experience Lead for Charities and Individuals here at CAF, and I'll be hosting today's session. It's absolutely fantastic to have so many of you with us, and I think that really speaks to the value of coming together to reflect on what's happening across our sector. For those of you who may be a little bit less familiar with CAF, also known as the Charities Aid Foundation, our mission is to accelerate progress in society towards a fair and sustainable future for all. We work at the heart of the giving ecosystem, supporting donors, businesses, and charities to ensure that money, expertise, and impact can flow to where it's needed most. A key part of that work is the research that we produce, which helps us and the wider sector better understand how and why people give and how that is changing over time. And so that brings us very neatly onto today's focus, the UK Giving Report 2026. This report brings together the latest insights on how people across the UK are giving today, alongside 10 years of nationally representative data. So it not only looks at what's happened over the past 12 months, but also builds a longer term picture of how generosity has evolved over the last decade, offering a really comprehensive view of the current state of individual giving in the UK. Within the report, we explore trends in participation, who is giving, how they're giving, and how that is changing, as well as when and why donations are happening. It looks at the factors shaping people's decisions to give, including trust, purpose, and the wider financial context, and it highlights how behaviours are evolving as both households and us in the charity sector are being continually squeezed. Alongside these insights, the report also includes practical recommendations to help charities respond to these trends and plan ahead. Those of you that have already dug into our report will know there's a lot of ground covered, and while we won't be able to cover everything in detail over the next hour we have together, we hope to bring some of the most important themes to life. And with so many of you joining our session today, you represent charities of all shapes, sizes, and types. So the themes we've chosen to focus on today are ones that we believe are likely to be of most interest to as many of you as possible. And like many of you, we also use this research internally to sense check what we're seeing in practice, to ask ourselves whether these insights reflect our own experiences, and to explore how we can respond positively to some of the more challenging trends highlighted in the data. So today, our focus is on sharing some of those reflections with all of you and broadening out that conversation. We'll start by looking at the headline findings from the report and what they tell us about the current landscape. We'll then explore some of the broader structural trends affecting the sector before taking a closer look at trust, the levels of public trust in charities and social purpose organisations today, why it matters, and what we can do to strengthen it. We'll also spend some time focusing on the opportunities in front of us, not just the challenges, and consider the importance of investing and testing in your work at a time when many organisations are being asked to do so much more with less. And throughout the session, we'll be thinking about what is within our control as fundraisers and charity professionals, and how we can begin to respond to and shape the future of giving in the UK. We'll leave time at the end for your questions, so please do share your thoughts in the chat function as we go along. So, without further ado, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce you to two of my wonderful colleagues, Sam Ryder and James Moore from CAF's Impact Consultancy team, who will be walking us through their response to this year's UK Giving Report. Sam, I'll hand over to you.
Hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is Sam Ryder and I'm a Senior Impact Consultant at CAF. And I focus on how CAF and the wider philanthropy ecosystem can best support charities to build their resilience, which obviously in turn ensures that giving results in the greatest possible impact. I've worked in this sector all my career in various leadership roles as a CEO, trustee, and various director of income generation and comms roles. And that's ranged from large charities such as Shelter, Hospice UK, through to more mid-sized environmental, education and arts organisations, as well as causes where fundraising is really challenging, such as criminal justice charities. I'm also very committed to championing the role of fundraisers, who are, after all, the critical agent in philanthropy. And I always remain in awe of and very proud of fundraising colleagues in terms of the incredible breadth of skill, energy, empathy, and tenacity that is required. And to support that amazing skill set, I lead the professional qualifications for the Chartered Institute of Fundraising and have written and delivered some charity management and philanthropy degrees. So, in that spirit of always learning and developing, we're delighted to share with you some of our thoughts, but more importantly, finding out more about your thoughts too. So, over to James.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everybody. My name's James Moore. I work with Sam in the Impact Consultancy. And I first worked with charities and in fundraising just over 20 years ago when I did telephone fundraising. And I call people up and ask them for regular giving. So very relevant for the conversation we'll have today. I then did a few other things. I remember my first call, it was for the RSPCA. But for about the last 15 years, I've been a consultant in the charity sector, working just like Sam across a range of different organizations, causes, and sizes. And I think one thing we're very aware of is the shared challenges across the sector, but also the shared opportunities. Like, what can we bring in as a group, as a selection of people who are committed to this, who care about the causes we all work for and want to see change with, and how we can kind of bring best practice together, how we can bring advice and really just shared understanding to the challenges we face and how we can meet them and look at growth and look at opportunities to take forward. So that's the spirit in which we've come at this UK Giving Report, is to say, yes, there is information there, there's themes we need to address, but what can we take from it to move forward? And that's hopefully what we'll be sharing today. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you. So the UK Giving Report is based on a nationally representative sample of participants, and it uses a survey conducted online which collects responses from people every month. So it's 12 months worth of data. And as Laura said, whilst there's lots of data in this report and sitting behind this report, we've picked out three highlights that we think underline that the changes that we're seeing are just not just a dip in giving, but probably a cultural shift. And those are that the public is split, so half give and half do not give. We've lost 6 million donors in the last decade, and obviously that affects organisational resilience, brings greater risk to long-term sustainability. And those that do give are those who trust and believe in charities. On average, those who donate are older, wealthier, and feel both more positive and connected to their local area and community. James, next slide, please. Brings back memories. So total giving has fallen. The headline figures show that 14 billion was donated by the public in individual donations and participatory fundraising activities like sponsoring friends or family. And this compares to 15.4 billion in 2024. So that represents a 10% year-on-year fall, which in cash terms is a drop between the 2 years of 1.4 billion. And this is the first time that we've also seen a fall in the total value of giving. So not just the number of people that give, but the total value received into the sector. And that's the first time since 2021 where we particularly felt the impact of the pandemic. James. So we're witnessing a shrinking donor base. Fundamentally, less people are donating or supporting participatory fundraising, and that has been a downward trend over the last 10 years. So we have a shrinking donor base, and that means that the challenge for fundraisers is no longer just about how much people give, but whether people are giving at all. And there are around 6 million fewer donors than a decade ago. So 10 years ago, the vast majority of the population, nearly 70%, either donated or sponsored someone, and now only 55% are doing so. And when we split that out between those who donate, that's half the population, 50%. But those that say they're sponsoring family or friends is now down to 21%. And so this means that Britain has lost around 600,000 donors per year since 2016. This is a steady decline despite a small bounce back after the pandemic. So the numbers that give now are lower than in the pandemic, which is when fundraising events, etc., had to stop and people were facing a great sense of distress and uncertainty. So the consistency of this decline means that we're seeing wider disengagement from giving. So we're seeing not just a fall in numbers, but we're seeing a fall in average values. And that shift this year is that donors are giving less on average, and that's the driver that is bringing the total amount down. So the average mean means monthly donations this year were £65 rather than 62 in 2024. And the mean donation dropped slightly from £28 in 2024 down to 26. So both volume and value is falling. Furthermore, whilst the total amount given each year has historically broadly kept up with inflation, if we look at the brown column on this chart, which shows the value of giving adjusted for inflation, we can see that this year the gap between the total value given and its adjusted inflation value is being squeezed. So what does this mean for the sector? Donor decline has obviously a real cost for charities, and the consistent decline in numbers of people giving over the last decade means that the sector has lost a total of 12.4 billion over that 10-year period. That's the equivalent of nearly 90% of what was given last year. The risk going forwards is that if the total giving fails to match inflation rates, charities are going to struggle even more to keep up with costs and demands. And from our own CAF Charity Insights research in 2025, we know that 44% of charity leaders cited rising costs as one of their main challenges. Alongside that, the number of volunteers has fallen, so that impacts on service delivery capacity. And at the same time, the demand for charity services continues to grow. So again, our own Charity Insights research showed that 83% of charities recorded an increase in demand over the previous 12 months. And even high-profile charities are exposed to this structural risk. And in recent months, we've seen redundancies and restructures in the big charities like Macmillan Cancer Support, Samaritans and Oxfam. So it's affecting across the sector. So why do people decide not to give? The research results mean that there is now pretty much a 50-50 split between those who give and those who do not. And amongst those who do not, there are some barriers to giving that are external and very difficult for us to influence. Some that as a sector, we can collectively work together to move the dial on, and some that we might be able to influence as individual charities. The overwhelming barrier is affordability, and that is across all demographics. What can we do about that? Well, we need to ensure that we are really segmenting our audiences so that we're matching ask levels to segments' potential affordability to give. We also need to get more creative in terms of how we highlight the impact of even small donations. So over the years, we've seen lots of charities doing things like equating the value of impact to the value of buying a posh coffee once a week. What more could we do around those propositions? What's more concerning than affordability is that 1 in 3 non-donors cite a lack of interest in giving at all. And that also includes a lack of interest amongst those who are higher rate and additional rate taxpayers. And the non-giving higher rate taxpayers are much more likely than average to say that it didn't occur to them to donate, they don't particularly care about charity, they forgot, or they just didn't want to. So this suggests that there's a gap between those top earners that have got the capacity to give and how much they trust and relate to the work of charities. We're also seeing disengagement as highest amongst young people. So whilst younger people have always given less than older generations, and over the decades as they age, they start to replace the inevitable loss of older donors, the question with current disengagement levels is, will this be the case going forwards? And there are some studies that show that young people, having grown up with social media, are more exposed to stories of scams, whether or not those are to do with charities, and have an increased skepticism in terms of both giving and institutions generally. So the question is then, how do we as charities turn young people's disappointment in current systems and structures into a belief that charities are critical in terms of those long-term solutions? And what can we learn from some of the brands that are attracting younger customers with an ethical proposition and storytelling? And this is an area that CAF are going to do some more research in the coming year. And these wide issues of trust is also something James is going to pick up on in a bit more detail in a moment. So are we facing a systemic challenge in terms of an engagement gap between donors or the public and charities? So affordability and trust are part of a mixture of interacting and reinforcing dynamics behind the engagement gap with charities. And the other factors in this are things like rates of community participation and some social and cultural shifts. And all this is potentially, in terms of looking through this as a systems lens, affecting one another. So as disposable income shrinks, fewer people give, so the effectiveness of charities can weaken. And if this weakens further, then charities' ability to demonstrate the very impact that donors need to see and the value for money that donors want to be reassured of is put at risk. That reduces trust in charities relevance, all of which are the critical prerequisites of giving. There's also shifts in terms of social and cultural factors. We know religious participation is dropping, and we know people with a religious belief are more likely to be donors. We also know that people who identify as liberals are more likely to donate. Politics has polarised, and we've seen this in the criticism of work like organisations such as RNLI. And there's also a general reduction in public trust of public institutions, which charities are often put in the same category as. So the challenge in terms of that, through that systems lens, is that fewer people are part of groups where giving is the social norm. And we can see that with falling payroll giving and employee fundraising. And there's a significant number of people volunteering for charity. And so with skepticism leads to lower levels of engagement. As people become less exposed to what charities do, they're less likely to trust them, which means they're less likely to give. And the less engagement people have with giving means that giving is less visible in people's lives and becomes less of a social norm. So what can we do collectively? We need to perhaps tell our bigger stories and focus, rather than focusing on our specific campaigns and impact stats, to think about collectively how we can tell the sort of epic collective story of what giving makes possible over time. So global extreme poverty has dropped by 2/3 in 30 years. Charities help fund the COVID-19 vaccine. Nearly 13 million lives have been saved from malaria since 2000, all because people donate. So when people see that giving works on that historic scale, it can strengthen belief, and we know belief is needed for people to give. We need to make the first steps to engagement frictionless and easy. So research shows that small civic actions like signing a petition make people more likely to donate. So we need to encourage people to take those small steps and steward them and ensure that they know how important and valued those steps are to us. And we also need to reinforce the social norms of giving by celebrating as widely as we possibly can the 50% who are giving. So I'm going to hand over to James now, who's going to talk a bit more about the role of trust.
Thank you very much, Sam. Yeah, really great points as well around kind of the systemic issue that's influencing a lot of this. So one of the things you've seen in the report and in the wider discussion actually since the UK Giving Report came out is these stats around trust, and that trust really is an indicator of whether or not someone is likely to support a charity and to give. And you can see there that 72% high trust, 33% low trust. You're much more likely to donate. You're more likely to give internationally. More causes at higher levels. But of course, that is a prerequisite for giving rather than necessarily the trigger. And also, as someone who works at a charity, as a fundraiser in communications, whatever your role, understanding what drives trust is really crucial. It's such a key part of how and when people choose to engage in the sector and choosing charities. Now, the Charity Commission did a really good report on trust actually about 18 months ago, looking at what does drive trust. They did surveys, they did focus groups. And you can see here the things that people said were very important, such as spending money, most of the money raised directly, operating to high ethical standards, etc., and what they felt charities delivered. And that gives you the gap, which is in many ways the points where trust is being eroded, or people who are not necessarily predisposed to trust charities are seeing that problem. And you've got, the top one there, spending most of the money raised directly on the causes the charity supports. Very, very important, but only just over 50% think that's what happens. Now, we'll work in the sector. We know that's what happens. We know that charities spend the money very wisely and very transparently, but the perception is not necessarily there. And you can see within that, there's quotes around what actually influences this. And you've got media coverage is particularly influential. National charities tend to be trusted a little bit less. And negative news stories, be it on traditional broadcast media or on social media, for example, do have a lot of impact, but they do tend to be limited to the specific charity. However, once that is gone, it's very hard to get it back. And one thing we've looked at when we've worked with organizations is you can turn this around as well. So rather than saying, oh, charities being on the news erodes trust, charities being on the news also gains trust. It also is very, very important for showing that you are making a difference and that you are out there doing the work people think you should be doing. Now, if you look at these levers, if you like, these elements of what's driving people's trust in charities, you can start to break them up. You've got that ethical transparency nature we've talked about. You've got competent. Are you good at doing your jobs? Do you do it in the right way? Elements of community. Do you bring people together? As well as impact and the way you tell the story. Now, if you can break down trust into those factors that you can influence, then that's how you start to kind of gain more trust in your organization specifically. And if you produce more trust amongst your supporters, that should probably lead to more donations. If you produce more trust amongst the communities that you work with, that's going to help you do the work you want to do and do the programs that you influence. Now, a hat tip here to Alan Freeman, who actually wrote an article about this in this month's Fundraising magazine on a very similar topic around what this trust metric really means and how you influence it. And he had these 5 factors, which you can see are very similar to that Charity Commission work, which is ethical trust. Are you doing the right thing? That competence element. Are you effective and capable? The impact. Do people believe their gift makes a difference? The relational elements. Do you treat me well? Am I valued? And that narrative. Do I believe the story, the way you're telling the story about your work? Does it relate to my life? Does it operate in the context that I see? And this is really interesting because it allows you to start thinking about, okay, if trust is so important to whether or not someone's going to donate, what are the steps I can take to have an impact on these areas to say, okay, let's look at improving our competence trust. Let's look at improving the narrative that we have and whether people believe the way we're putting our work across. Now, this will all any advice that we give in a webinar like this to over 500 organizations is going to be broad. And one thing we have definitely seen in our work is that everyone's different. What works for one organization doesn't work for another. You have to zero in on what works for you. But there are themes. So if you're looking at, are you doing the right thing? That call to action, your kind of lead proposition, that needs to be aligned across both what people believe they're giving to and what you deliver, your kind of core programs. People need to understand who you are as an organization and the general work you do very clearly and quite simply. That feeds into competence. Can they see the evidence of that? Are you in the conversation? Are you in the news? Are they seeing you in the media that they interact with? Doing the work you're doing without necessarily asking for a donation? Are they just seeing you being part of that cause, of that work? That feeds into visibility. Who's telling that story? It can't just be you. You have to bring people on board to celebrate that success locally, with other people, with news outlets, with other trusted third parties. And also, it needs to be about positive change. It can't always be need. You have to show what's been achieved to produce the element of impact and competence. Um, then obviously know your audience. This has been said a lot, but what are people's key motivations? What are the key moments where they want you to come into their lives? Understand that. Speak to donors, find out what they want and need from you, and then reflect that in how you go about your communications and your fundraising. And then finally, that point around trust and the narrative that you project into the conversation and into your work. Consistency can be really crucial there. It doesn't mean you have to say the same thing all the time, but again, if you have a kind of aligned call to action, a key proposition that goes throughout your work, a way of doing things, and you consistently embody that kind of with authenticity, with real stories, with proof of impact, that leads to people trusting and believing what you say more. Because you're proving it, because you're demonstrating it in how you talk to them and how they see you. And we've got a couple of case studies later on where this comes through very clearly, in that when people have grown their audience or their income, that consistency of message and kind of understanding where they show up and how they do it and what people see about them has been really important in that growth. So it's really important to understand what levers you can pull to influence trust. And that leads into other opportunities as well, which Sam's gonna mention.
Yeah, so we kind of sort of doom and gloom of the stats we've got. We wanted to highlight that there are some positives and opportunities out there. The big one being legacy income, which has been on the rise, and more people are including charities in their wills than ever before. So that's a real positive. People are also writing their first wills when they include a charity in their 40s and 50s. So legacy messaging needs to start when donors are relatively young and to be drip fed through all your comms across your audiences. There's also the anticipated huge shift, the great wealth transfer over the next 3 decades, where it's estimated that between £5 and £7 trillion is going to shift in wealth to a younger generation from the older generation, which means finding ways today of engaging with those younger audiences through participation. Participation that might not involve giving, but is laying the groundwork in terms of demonstrating your impact for when that shift happens. And also thinking about your mid-value giving program. So we can see from the chart that whilst the golden goose are the 6 and 7 figure gifts from high net worth, it's actually the higher rate taxpayers with incomes up to 125,000 that contribute the largest proportion of donations and are most likely therefore to donate. So the question there is, are you developing mid-value products and stewardship programs, or disproportionately focusing on the extremes of low value gifts and high value gifts? James.
Thank you. Sorry, it's taken me a little while to unmute today. That's picking up on some of the hidden factors that sit behind fundraising and fundraising success. Now, in mine and Sam's team, we often come into organizations to look at something like a fundraising strategy or a challenge in a certain area of giving, corporate partnerships, for example, private donors. And what happens is you have to look at the whole ecosystem of the organization. There's a great chart here by Sarah Squire, a fundraising expert, around all the factors that have to combine to deliver fundraising success. And there's a lot. And often when you come in with a fundraising lens saying, let's raise more money, actually there are other issues to tackle. And one of the ones we see a lot is kind of that proof element I spoke about earlier, monitoring and evaluation. And we'll see perhaps in larger charities, they'll lack, there's really emotive case studies, particularly about things that donors want to support. You might have a case study about your impact, but is it around also what people believe they are supporting? Is that aligned? Can you see that proof? And then with smaller organizations, often who are in sometimes closer to the beneficiaries or the people they're working with, you have those great case studies, but you can't always place it into that wider systemic change that people like trusts and foundations want to see. So to build those elements of fundraising success, it's also thinking about the wider ecosystem of your organization and is it working as well as it can? Have you got that impact narrative? Perhaps, for example, a theory of change that you can slot your case studies and your particular outcomes into to show how they're having an impact on the kind of wider system that we're in. Now, when all of this comes together, what do we know? It is getting harder, and there's lots of things we want to see, but we want to kind of touch on this and then move to some more examples, I think. Is that Sam? Were you going to do, or you're on mute?
Oh, next slide, James.
There we go.
So as James says, it's getting harder. So what might the path forwards look like? Well, we know there's lots of people from different organisations here at different stages in their individual giving journeys. Some might be struggling to build an individual giving programme. Some of you might be looking at it as a means of diversifying. What matters most, though, is focusing on what you can do best with your resources, and that might not include individual giving. In that, we know that only 23% of total income from across charities is from individual giving, individual donations and legacies anyway. Also, whilst we're big advocates of the importance of investing and testing, as James will talk a little bit more about in the moment, this does need to be balanced with whether you're doing too many things and whether you're spending too much on low return initiatives. If you are investing in something with low returns and it enables you to build a donor file by doing so, how are you planning to develop those relationships into longer term supporters? And are you investing in the stewardship that's going to help you get there? But whilst the other side of the coin is that whilst not all causes have wide public appeal, it doesn't mean that individual giving isn't possible. In my last role at Women in Prison, it was clear that engaging the public in donating to women in the criminal justice system was going to be a pretty tough call. But we found our tribe. We looked at who was engaging with us on LinkedIn and we found a niche. And with very little data, we identified that those that were following us, liking us, supporting us were female lawyers. And if we look at wider research, it's hardly surprising in that studies show that across the generations, people tend to give organisations and causes they're either familiar with, have a personal connection with, or somehow fit and reinforce their self-identities, hence our female lawyers. So we weren't going to have broad appeal, but we found our tribe. And we really focused on relationship building. So we responded to women's posts. We invited them to policy events and things that we're already doing because we had no fundraising budget. And we built a holistic relationship, trying to understand them, who they work for, how they networked, what their interests were. In over a short period, 5 months, we ran one campaign, raised 30,000, our first foray into individual giving. But we also encouraged celebrating and sharing to drive peer asking, which we know is a key driver of people giving, which resulted in 2 high value gifts of over 200,000, and one of the supporters companies adopting us for Charity of the Year. Meant we knew we had mid-value and high-value donors that we could nurture. We then developed a peer-to-peer giving circle donation product because we knew that fitted in with how these women networked. So, as James has said, it's all about meeting people where they are, be that in terms of their media use, what they're doing on and offline, their values, their interests, their self-identities, and that goes for whether it's female lawyers or whether it's gamers and content creators for a youth charity. But underpinning that is the message that it's also recognizing that individual giving is often iterative. It's all about relationship building, so it may be iterative rather than perhaps transformative in the way that it was 5, 10 years ago. James.
Yeah, and just really great results there from that kind of approach. And I think, as we move forward and we look at, what we can do, and we've got that polarization, 50% of people that give, 50% who don't currently, it's focusing in on that 50% who do give and finding out as much as you can about them in the short term, and making sure your offer is aligned to that audience. And, when we look at different causes, we look at organizations, those who are having more success have found the thing that works for them in their area. And we've often seen, for example, if you have more community impact, products such as lotteries work very well for you if you tie it into how you're seen by that community and being part of it working together. Similarly, if you're a health cause, you'll know, in memoriam, in honor giving is really important. That drives events. It also drives, your general giving, your appeals, legacies. If you're a rights-based organization, it's about the collective. It's about showing impact, individual roles. What does that individual donor make happen when we need a whole movement for change? You've got to really define that in order to break through and get people to support you. And of course, legacy fundraising runs below all of this. We could do a whole nother hour on the kind of systemic forces shaping that, the generational wealth transfer. That's going to be showing so much growth, and you really have to make sure that, again, your normal fundraising integrates really well with legacies. On that point, this is a regular giving file from an organization. You'll see there, this is their regular givers. Over 70% of them are over 50 years old. So your regular givers are a great audience generally. Mostly people's regular giving files are perhaps older than they're not often perceived to be. It's a great audience to start that legacy message and secure those bequests in your file. So let's look at some kind of more detailed case studies of what people have done against this backdrop of a declining giving and a decline in participation. So we've reached out, we've spoken to a couple of organizations about what they've done when we've known they've had success. So this is Safe Haven for Donkeys, which is an international equine charity. And I spoke to Debbie Warren from Inspired Fundraising about their program. And they've really, over this time period, so over the last 5 or 6 years, gone from just 4,000 donors to over 12,000 kind of active donors in that database. That's a really strong growth amongst this background. And they've done it, and this is often a theme, by working on the things that we know are important and that people talk about connecting to their audience, about having offers that are really kind of clear for them. So they started out actually back in 2019. They were in a really bad place, had to do an emergency appeal because it looked like they might actually have to close some of their centres. That got them a kind of certain kick, and then there was the pandemic. But what they found was at that period, they could actually do really good recruitment, and they had very strong, tangible offers online, things like veterinary care kits, first aid kits, that people could support at a time of need. And that worked great for direct acquisition. But then that stopped working. It would go down, and they had to shift. So what did they do? They looked at that same channel where they could bring in people at low cost, but went to kind of building their own proprietary email lists, doing lead generation, kind of donkeys deserve better statement, and then using those people that come on board to drive ongoing communication, trust, conversion to regular giving. And what's been at the center of all of this is something very simple, which is a weekly e-newsletter. Now, it's a weekly e-news, but it's not charity news. It's literally just stories about what donations have made possible, and very contextualized, very of the moment. You'll see here, this is what you've just given to. We'll bring you an update very soon, including photos of what you've helped to support. Proof, trust. Those are the themes that come through. And it was interesting when when I was talking to Debbie about this, she said, look, when we got these new donors on board, we wanted to make sure they trusted us as much as those other donors we've had for a long time. And this is how you do that, by showing up consistently with a clear offer over time and showing again and again what you've made possible, and really excluding information that isn't about that from those key news moments that they have. And you'll see in the feedback they get from their audience just how appreciated this is and how people love that feedback, which they kind of trust and rely on. Another kind of a different approach, and this is from children's hospices across Scotland. They've grown in the last 10 years from a £250,000 organisation to a £4 million organisation. So again, against this backdrop of losing 6 million donors, they've gained a lot of donors and gained a lot of income. Now, that 10 years ago, before they introduced this strategy and kind of did this invest and test program, they were obviously, it's children's hospices. It's an emotive cause. It's something that you would think you can go out and raise money for. But there wasn't as much awareness of their impact as an organization or the need of hospices in Scotland for charitable support. People didn't know they were charities and didn't know they needed them. And that's led very much to actually what's worked for them. So they've done a couple of key things in the background that have then helped the actual fundraising. And the first of those is to get a really consistent proposition across all communications, both comms and fundraising, which is that no one should face the death of their child alone. That runs through everything they do. They've also worked very hard on getting much higher levels of kind of media awareness and presence to show the work they're doing so that people are aware of them in their communities before they get to that fundraising ask. And that's been very, very crucial in driving those barriers of people not understanding they're a charity, not understanding the need, or not knowing who they are. So now they are kind of present in that news cycle, putting out, the positive stories that they can to show the impact of their work when they then meet people where they are, which in their case is things like face to face. It's like a community lottery because they're reflecting that community element of children's hospices across Scotland. People are much, much more willing to engage with that and set up regular gifts and give to a lottery and continue to do it because much of the feedback they get is seeing them in local news, on the TV, in newspapers. And as Ian says there, we've done the basics of fundraising really well and built an ecosystem, if you like, where they can come in and raise money effectively because people are aware of them and know who they are and what they do. So a lot of this is just getting things to work together across the different aspects of your organization with a clear idea of who you are, what you stand for, and what people are going to want from you when you fundraise. And then that leads us on to a really great opportunity, which is, of course, Gift Aid, Sam.
Yeah, so the simple message here with gift aid is don't leave it on the table. A lot of it is unclaimed. Remember, you only need to sign people up once. If you're signing up for future gifts, and also you can also back claim gifts as well. Don't just think about gift aid in the context of your individual donors. There's the people that are sponsoring others. Also, if you've got shops, your shop donors. Shop donors are a younger audience, and we also know that audience, not necessarily younger ones, but that audience as well, are prime for as lottery prospects and legacy targets as well. So a great low risk way of increasing your net income.
There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sam and James, for that really comprehensive overview of not just what is included in our report, but actually what we as a sector might be able to do to buck some of those trends and really support ourselves. I just wanted to address some of the issues that we've been having. Really sorry if a couple of you have been experiencing some sound issues, but we're trying to work on that. And also, yes, to reassure you all, I know a lot of people have been saying that the slides have been really fantastic. So we will be sending out a recording after this to make sure that you have those slides and you can engage with colleagues on some of the things that we've been talking about as well. Thank you so much, Sam, James. I wanted to move straight on to our Q&A session. So some of you very generously on the call have already submitted your questions in advance. So we had 3 that we thought really captured the sentiment of the themes that were coming out in these questions, and then also if anyone would like to add any more questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, please do. We will try and to get through as many as possible in the next 15 minutes. So first question that came through really strongly is talking about direct debit donations and those regular giving donations in the individual space. I think the question that really captures the sentiment is it still worth the initial investment, or is this becoming less effective? Sam, what are your thoughts?
Well, although there are an increased cancellation of direct debits, we still think regular giving is important. Returns might be lower, but they're still generally going to be better than going for cold recruitment, particularly given that there's a shrinking pool of donors in the first place. Retention is key, so it's not just about investing in that recruitment, it's really thinking through that stewardship and how well resourced that's going to be. As James has already mentioned, within the regular giving files, there's usually a potential stream there of legacy givers. It is a chance to bring people closer to your organisation anyway and demonstrate your impact through that regular communication. And there will be other things that you might be able to cross-sell to them if appropriate. So yes, we would say yes, it's still worth it. James, I don't know if you've got something to add on that.
Well, I think yeah, it's not a channel that obviously many people will have it already. I think if you're introducing it, which is kind of the point of this question, it's thinking about how you pitch it. And it's great to just have it there as an always on. It's a way that you can say, yes, you can support us. But it's also worthwhile looking at who's made it work very, very well. And if you look at organizations like MSF, for example, Médecins Sans Frontières, they very consistently had a regular giving offer as their lead offer. If you want to support them, you sign up to a regular gift. And it's quite high. It's around £20 a month. And if we think about when regular giving was introduced, I believe in the early 90s. The Oxfam advert, I think the ask was £2 a month, you know, and that was 30 years ago, probably more. I can't do the maths. But if you look at that and you look at the inflationary pressures we're seeing all around, many asked out there are still £3, £4, £5 a month. Should we all be asking for £20? It's a question, and we don't want to exclude people. And we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to take part. But I think it's worthwhile thinking in light of the mid-value points that Sam said earlier of where you're pitching regular giving and can you build a slightly more valuable regular giving file by asking for a bit more if you align it to clear outcomes and proof and evidence and trust and all those areas. But I think they're the things to think about in terms of where you place it.
Thanks so much, James and Sam. And I totally agree. I think that regular individual giving doesn't mean that it's not impactful and that you can't demonstrate that impact in action just because it's a quote unquote regular or unrestricted giving. It's still such a fundamental way to demonstrate the impact in real time. Um, On to our next question. So, Sam, James, I know that this is something that came across really strongly, not just in our UK giving report, but it's something that is being really talked about in the sector widely at the moment is younger donors and Gen Zs. And we know that they are very values and ethics led, that they have a really strong sense of purpose and justice, but that's not necessarily translating into giving. So, how much impact does ethical fundraising have on the desire for younger generations to support a charity?
Well, I think we need to understand what we mean by ethical fundraising here. And fundraising is generally considered to be ethical if it's honest about impact, transparent about finances, and program outcomes, respects the purposes for the gifts being used, isn't misleading. Donor data is kept safe. So that is something that I don't think it matters whether you're a younger donor or older donor, your fundraising needs to be ethical. And these are like the hygiene factors that need to be in place for anybody to give. I do think probably younger generations more so than older generations do want to see EDI embedded in everything that the organisation is doing. We know that younger donors tend to be less loyal. It's kind of okay because they're finding their way. Um, they are supporting charities, but not necessarily as donors. So they're in charity shops, they're participating in events, they're signing petitions. And so it's about kind of meeting them where they are and investing in that engagement, even if there's not a cash return. Thinking about where they are engaging, though, those activities are not necessarily about your cause. It may be transactional, kind of maybe always has been, but recognizing that Also, kind of, are we talking about ethical here, or are we talking about authenticity? Young people are much more interested in authenticity. They don't want shiny, glossy brochures. They want to hear from the beneficiary. And there's some great stuff that you might want to look at, adverts done by Islamic Relief, where they've targeted a younger audience and they've done it with self-identity, self-deprecation, and humour, and those can be found on Sophie, and that they do show a good understanding of a younger audience. So I don't think they're looking for something necessarily different in terms of ethical fundraising, but I think they are looking for authenticity.
Yeah, yeah.
I just agree with that. Great point, Sam.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And finally, one of our pre-submitted questions is, to what extent is the drop in the number of people giving a reflection of the cost of living crisis, or is there a broader decline in philanthropic giving due to other reasons? That's really, our social behavioral factors. How are we interacting and intersecting with everything else going on in society and the world today?
Yeah, I think we've sort of touched on that. I don't think, as a sector, I don't think we know enough about that in terms of those other drivers that are not to do with affordability. And I think that's something where organisations like ourselves, charities, government, donors, academics could be doing an awful, or need to do an awful lot of more work in terms of what those underlying drivers are. So we don't kind of, I haven't got the answer here today. But I think the fact that it's more than cost of living is perhaps reflected in the data that we've got that shows that giving's been consistently dropping over the last 10 years. It's not something that is just about the last 5 years. And the fact that more people were giving during the pandemic and participating in events and during the pandemic, or saying they were, is quite interesting as well in terms, and then, we've had this, big cultural, social, political shifts kind of subsequent to that. In terms of the actual data, we've only been asking the question since 2024 as to affordability being a factor behind non-giving. So we haven't got the long-term data to really track that, but what we can say is that so this year 49% of non-donors were saying that affordability was their main reason for not giving. In 2024 it was 44%. So it has gone up, but that's just 1 year's data.
Thanks so much, Sam. James, were there any comments on that one?
Not particularly on that one. I think these are things that obviously, as we've got to this point in the research cycle, I think we're looking to address some of these factors on younger donors, affordability in the future reports that are coming out. And I believe there's talk of potentially a younger person focus in terms of some of the next reports. So I know that our research team are looking at this, and there will be more information that comes out around these areas. And it's some themes that we'll track moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. So much more to dig into on that, as we can tell. And I just wanted to, on that point, address a couple of the questions that have been coming through in our Q&A function, more about world giving or international giving, also high net worth and ultra high net worth giving, and corporate giving as well. So we have a real suite of research put together by our wonderful research team. There's so much to find out on our website. So please do take a look at our world giving report, our corporate giving reports, and more about our high and ultra high net worth donor trends. Um, a bit of a change in gear, I think, on the next question, which has just come through from someone, which is um, more broadly around motivation. So we know there's a huge amount of fundraisers and charity professionals that are working their socks off at the moment in pretty challenging conditions. And we can see this data isn't always sunshine. So Sam, James, what do you guys recommend to keep fundraisers motivated and invested in their fundraising career? Any top tips from you guys as charity professionals?
Well, there's no one thing, but I think it's obviously important that fundraisers have got realistic targets. and that clearly comes from the top. There's work to be done, I believe, with trustees in terms of building their understanding of the challenges that fundraisers face and the realities of the external environment, particularly when as well they're also looking to diversify income. So it does kind of start at the top in terms of thinking about the day-to-day pressure that is on individual fundraisers. Kind of more broadly, we know that we are asking for the most incredible skill set from fundraisers. You've got to be able to analyze data, you've got to be able to present, you've got to be able to, especially if you're doing a bit of everything, you've also got to write proposals, you've got to be like very personable with donors and understand donors like psychology. I mean, there's so much. Um, and within that context, the pay is atrocious for the skill set that we're after. It's really bad. So we need to think about well-being more broadly. We can't pay where people perhaps should be being paid. So thinking about flexible working, thinking about what training can we not necessarily invest in financially, because there's lots of great training out there that isn't expensive or free, but giving people the time and space to do that, the time and space to peer network so they know that they're not on their own. They know this isn't necessarily about them, it's those wider factors and structural factors. There's amazing research and resources out there for fundraisers, but as we're fighting that like day-to-day pressure, we never get to read it, we never get to engage it, we never have the headspace to actually start thinking about how we can do things differently and better. So I think space, um, right tools, being asked to deliver things and you may not have a database. So making sure that those fundamental tools are in place. And collectively as well, we mustn't talk ourselves down. And as James has highlighted, there are successes out there, and there can be successes even kind of in the more difficult and smaller organizations. I think it's about being realistic and yeah, making sure that fundraisers got the investment to do those work, which are all great, easy things for me to say sitting here. And I know organizations are having very difficult conversations, but it fundamentally just have to remember what we're doing is fantastic and we must try not to talk ourselves down.
I'd also say, Sam, and I think they're really, really great points around, targets and communication and where people position themselves. I think if you do want to be motivated, a really great way of doing it is to speak to donors. I have spent a lot of my career, interviewing donors at different levels of giving. They are invariably wonderful people who really care about the causes that you have. And a great way to kind of remotivate yourself is speak to them. It doesn't have to be for a reason. You can set up calls, you can go and see some, and it is always, I find, genuinely really inspiring and humbling to meet these people who give so much time and money, long lists of organizations they support to causes that we work for. So I would say, yeah, also remember that you can go to the source, as it were, and speak to donors, and they will normally really motivate and inspire you.
Thank you so much, both. And I totally agree. I think sometimes when we're in the thick of it, we spend so much time telling other people why it's so important. What we're doing is so important that sometimes we need to remind ourselves as well. So thank you so much. I also saw a few questions coming through about more localized giving as well, whether that's place-based giving or more localized data. So I'm delighted to say to everyone that we will have our local giving report coming out in the next couple of months, which will really dig into that more regional data sets as well. So watch this space. We will let you know once that's coming out. And I can't quite believe it, but we are fully at time. It is midday, so I just want to take a really quick minute to say thank you so much to all of you for attending, for joining today's webinar and engaging with our UK Giving Report, taking time out of really hectic days to listen and discuss these complex issues with us. I also want to say a huge thank you to Sam Ryder and to James Moore for their really valuable insights and reflections. So, Sam and James both work in our impact consultancy team, providing a wide range of consultancy services to support charities and social purpose organisations to build their resilience. You can find out more about all of our consultancy work and the associated costs by searching for Impact Consultancy on the CAF website. And huge thanks to our equally wonderful marketing and events colleagues for making today happen. So, as we said before, after the session, we'll be reaching out to you via email with a recording of this session and also a link to the UK Giving Report in full. You can also register for our regular newsletter from within this email, so watch out for that landing in your inboxes in the next few days. And of course, we really value any and all feedback on these sessions and what you'd like to hear from us in the future. So please do email any comments or suggestions over email to events@cafonline.org. We'd really love to hear from you. So huge thanks once again for your time, and look forward to hearing from you again soon.